Welcome to this week's live stream. My name's Dr. Cameron Jones, and today we are talking about building inspections. Now, did you know that as of the end of July 2019, there were 25,110,000 Australians living in Australia? Now, that's a lot of people, that's a lot of homes, that's a lot of apartments. Back when the Australian Bureau of Statistics did the census back in 2016, they found that for every 5 detached and semi-detached dwellings, if you walk down any street in Australia, one person would be living in an apartment. Whereas back in 1991, for every 5 separated homes, there were 7 separated homes, there'd be one person living in an apartment. So there has been a massive increase in apartment living. And so that has a lot of flow-on effects to how homes, apartments are constructed. And we're going to be focusing on this today. And to put this in perspective, in the last 250 years, there have been approximately 10 million homes constructed, with over 1 million of those constructed in the last decade and a half. And I'm going to be bringing on a special guest called Colin Hamilton, and he's going to be talking about the role of a building inspector and what type of responsibilities a building inspector has and how they can help you if you run into trouble. And really, I want to, before we get Colin on and do the interview, I want to give you some background about really the social context to building inspections. And so, if we look at some historical facts, back in England, in between the 1840s and the 1870s, they developed something called an inspector of nuisances. And the first person was called Thomas Fresh. And he, in a sense, this was a government developed role. He was like a occupational hygienist and a little bit like a building inspector. So he had a role and responsibility for commenting on the building inhabitants and the builders. So he was very much like our present day building biologist. So he was looking at how the building affected the welfare. And he put out quite a lot of reports which were very useful to the city at that point in time in developing, changing customs in how people utilize the built environment. And our modern day building inspectors also have a lot of important knowledge that they can pass across to occupants to make better use of their built environment. Now, if we look at what the situation is, essentially this is an advisory role to government in a sense. That's what was happening back in the 1850s. But in our present day, if you're having water damage and mold, which is really what we focus on each week as part of this live stream, then if you're a tenant, you can contact Consumer Affairs, and they have some recommendations to what landlords and property managers should do when there are allegations of damp building conditions and moisture and mold. But what happens if you're not a tenant and you're a homeowner? Well, again, Consumer Affairs have information regarding what to do if you have a building dispute or there are defects and delays. Now, the whole issue of all of this is that if things do go wrong, then essentially you're going to need to consider getting an expert's advice. And the type of expert that you choose is going to have a big impact on the type of information that they're able to provide to you. So as I always say to people who are suffering from water damage and mold problems, work out what the building defects are first, then focus on the moisture and mold and your possible adverse health symptoms that might be a product of the building defects or the dilapidation in the building. And so when we talk to Colin, he's going to have some really interesting information to pass across to you. But what happens when you are considering purchasing a property? And just the other week, some former clients of mine rang me up and they said, can you come by tomorrow at 2 p.m? The agent is listing this property for sale. We want to put in an offer, but we don't want to move into a moldy property. Can you come down? So I looked in my diary, cleared some time, drove down there, met with the building inspector, of course the selling agents, the prospective purchaser, and myself. And our job was to quickly do an assessment of the property so we could inform the client whether or not we thought that the property was A-OK. And again, I stress that a building inspector is needed to comment on the defects, but people like myself or building biologists or occupational hygienists are certainly able to comment on the water damage, mold, and those sort of things. And again, Consumer Affairs have some very interesting information about this on their website. Now, the issue is that what happens if there is a building dispute? Well, again, you're starting to move into legal territory here, and I would refer you to your own legal counsel for specifics, but definitely the information provided at Consumer Affairs, at least in Victoria and in all other states of Australia, is very useful. Now, what happens if the dispute gets out of control? Well, then there is the Victorian Building Authority website, and they talk about really who you can talk with if you have problems with plumbing, electrical, and that sort of thing. So I really just want to highlight that these resources are out there. Similarly, the Domestic Building Dispute Resolution Service of Victoria is a group of people who can also provide dispute resolution and mediation if you find yourself in a dispute, because at the end of the day, really we're talking about, at least from my perspective in the main, some sort of building defect which is allowing moisture to either accumulate or enter or remain in close contact with building elements, which could then create a mold problem or an adverse indoor air quality issue. So the whole aim is to fix this, and since we're talking about something which was constructed, there is always a solution. It really just depends on how quickly the parties reach an agreement and move towards a resolution. I do realize that this is quite a complex problem, and yet there are resources out here to make this more streamlined. Now, when all else fails, you can take civil litigation, and in VCAT, or in Victoria it's called VCAT, and if you are talking about your own building, then basically you would be applying under the building and property list. If it's a tenancy related matter, it will appear under a different list, and again, the VCAT website or the civil litigation website in each state and territory will provide you with useful information about that. In New South Wales, it's called NCAT, and again, they have a commercial and a residential division. And in Queensland, it's called QCAT. And again, each of the states and territories have their own civil litigation process which needs to be followed. Now, what do these standards say? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to a he said, she said situation, in that if there is a problem with the building, even much later after handover of a property, or even if it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years after taking occupancy, a building inspector is still very, very important to you, because any renovations may need to comply with various standards as well. And what are those standards? Well, to some extent, you can get some useful information by going to one of these standard sellers, and they're essentially like a bookstore for rules and regulations. And if you go to the one which I use all the time, SAI Global here in Australia, you can get some free standard guides to building and construction, which at least pinpoint a group of standards which may apply to your particular situation. Now, The most common standards I've put up here relate to the general requirements that a building inspection needs to comply with, and Colin will be able to go into significant detail about this. But also there are another component of inspections is also the termite and pest inspection. And I just wanted to put this up on the screen to focus attention on the fact that they do exist and that your building inspector needs to comply with this and provide valid information which gives you a useful jumping off point to answer your questions about this. So before we go to our interview, I wanted to just review some key points from the research literature. So what does the research literature say about indoor air quality? Well, we know that we spend 80 to 90% of our time indoors, but 65% of our time is actually spent in the home. Now, therefore, we know from lots of other research, and over the preceding weeks we've talked at length about the importance of indoor air quality and how this can be affected by a lot of building-specific problems like venting and condensation and that sort of thing. But the research has, in a sense, there's not enough of it relating the building-specific properties with the epidemiology. So you can find examples from the literature which say that green building materials are more likely to show mold. In some instances, gyprock or plasterboard has shown to be actually manufactured with mold spores in it. And yet I can find other literatures which say that green building materials actually improve respiratory health. So there is a big, lots of question marks out there. And really, the reason for this is it's not that the research is wrong, but it means that each building is unique. Hence why you need to get a building inspector for your property, because you can't just translate one set of information sources or knowledge to your property, because you might be right, but you also might be wrong. And this is why we need experts. Now, what about when interventions in buildings do happen? And I want to review a really interesting piece of research that looked at the European experience and where they used questionnaires for the occupants' amenity and what their symptoms were. But that was also followed up with on-site building inspections by building experts. And they were looking at whether or not asking the people provided useful and valid data versus getting an inspector to come in and reassess the property from their perspective and using their experience. And what they found, and this was looking at schools and health, they found that in Europe that between 25 and nearly 50% of the schools had building problems. They also found that the questionnaires were good, but when that data was actually analysed, there were validity concerns because in a sense it was a self-reported questionnaire, and they found that it needed to be validated by on-site inspections. And again, this is government-driven research looking at whether or not they would send out inspectors to the schools or allow the schools to self-assess. And again, the conclusions were that sending in the building inspector is far more efficient. Now, what happens when they actually followed through with interventions? They followed through in these same schools with interviewing the students 1, 3, and 5 years after attending to the building defects. And they discovered that the self-reported health status of the students improved after repairs to the moisture damage in the school. But get this, this is the conclusion we're getting to, that there was a consistent decreasing trend in the prevalence of sinusitis, coughs, and asthma for new students. But this is the take-home message I want to make, that for those students that were initially exposed to the mold and water damage, they didn't really see an improvement in their symptoms, even after attending to the building defects. So attending to the building defects is fantastic for new groups of individuals becoming exposed to that environment when there is no problem. They don't show any adverse health. but even addressing the problems is not necessarily going to reduce the severity of the immune response in many cases that these students show. Now, what about those jurisdictions that have mandatory building inspections? And I'm going to focus on some research that came from Hong Kong. In 2012, it became law that buildings needed to be inspected. And I'm just going to focus again on the conclusions from this. They found that the importance of building inspections were to ensure that the properties were maintained and kept in good condition. And this is really to avoid injury of loss of life, because there were a lot of examples of building decay in Hong Kong, and there were a lot of problems with elements of the building actually falling off and causing injury. So they also found that mandatory building inspections led to changing the perception of the property owner's legal responsibilities with regard to maintaining their property. And they also discovered that it would safeguard the residents. It also created a lot of employment as well, and it improved the living environment and upgraded really the property values in Hong Kong by having these mandatory building inspections. So we are now going to move on to an interview with Colin Hamilton from CH Top Notch Constructions, and I'm going to get him on the line in a minute. I'm going to call through on Skype now. I'm just going to give you a bit of a background on Colin. He has essentially been constructing or doing building work in Melbourne, Victoria for over 32 years. He's been a registered builder for the last 20. He now does building inspections. He is trade qualified in carpentry and cabinetry. He has done all aspects of construction work. He has handled the construction of properties between $500,000 and $2 million. And he is a stickler for standards, as well as providing his knowledge and wisdom and education. He employs carpenters, and he takes great pride in passing on his knowledge to them, because at the end of the day, a good, well-constructed building is going to give a lifetime of pleasure to often many different families. And so it's really important that buildings are constructed well, and that the people carrying out the construction actually examine the property during the construction process to make sure that it is being done properly. And hence how Colin has now moving into building inspections. And so I'm going to ring him up now, and we're going to hear from Colin, and I'm going to talk with him about this important issue.
Hi, Cameron.
Hey, how are you? Very good to see you.
Yeah, great.
Good. Okay. I'm not sure what you were able to hear. I've got a couple of questions to ask you. Thank you for joining me this morning. I've already given you a bit of an intro, so I've talked about sort of your CV. But like I thought that certainly for the people who are tuning into my live stream, certainly because I do so much work in the built environment regarding moisture and water damage, I wanted to talk to you about your perspectives on this topic. I want to talk to you really about what your skill set is, because it's certainly not mine. I'm not trade qualified, although I spend an incredible amount of time in buildings. Usually a lot of the things that I focus on have a building decay or defect component to them. And although I'm always focusing on the microbiology or how this can impact on people's health and safety, at the end of the day, usually a builder needs to come on board and actually do a lot of the strip out work or that. And often the remediators try to do a lot of the building work where probably they shouldn't, and they should defer to an expert like yourself. And similarly, this whole issue of pre-purchase property inspections, or who should the consumer turn to when they've got a mold and water damage issue.
Yeah.
So
Great.
I guess I'm certainly happy to talk about anything, but to kick off, could you tell me what is a building inspection?
Okay, so there's a couple of different types of building inspections. When we initially, there'll be a building surveyor who's involved under a new construction, and he'll make sure the plans comply with the Australian standard and comply to the building code, NCC 2019 and the like. And he'll make sure that on the plans there's adequate ventilation for habitable rooms, which is 5% of the floor area. He'll make sure that the smoke detectors are in the right place. He'll make sure that there's mechanical ventilation where there needs to be. And he'll generally look at the list of the big picture components. And then once he approves the plans, then there's another building inspector that works along with a building surveyor. And his role is to do mandatory building inspections. And they are things like when we excavate in the ground, he'll check that the soil conditions are appropriate. He'll do a pre-inspection for steel placement if you're doing a slab, or stumps if you're doing stumps. Then he'll do a frame inspection. Okay. Then after his frame inspection, he'll do generally just a final. And the final inspection, he'll walk around and he'll ask you for glazing certificates, waterproofing certificates, insulation certificates, and the like. And he'll make sure that you've got smoke detectors in the right place. He'll make sure that the distance between the top of the fireplace and of the hot plate, and the underside of the range hood is adequate, etc. So that's their role. My role, I do pre-purchase inspections, defects reports, dilapidation reports. So I'm a builder, that's my background, and my background is I've built period-style homes, renovated period-style homes, houses that date back to 1854, through to houses that are of today. So I've seen a lot of different construction types. So we've got a fair amount of knowledge there, how things were done, how things are done now, and how things should be done. So my role as an inspector, if I get called in, and I usually get called in when things have gone wrong. So someone's usually looking for someone independent to give an unbiased opinion about what's gone wrong, and then to report on what's gone wrong. So I will go in there and I'll identify what the problem is, and often it relates to water, and just about everything relates to water. And it's either a leaking roof or a leaking bathroom, balconies are huge. Those three areas are probably the biggest areas for defects. And I'll go in and I'll assess what the defect is, how much damage it's done, and how to rectify it, and who's responsible for rectifying it. Because here in Victoria, if you've had something done in the last 10 years, we've got a 10-year window. So you're covered under warranty. People think homeowner's warranty, which homeowner's warranty only lasts for 6.5 years. The statutory law covers you for 10 years. So if someone's done something wrong or bad or not in accordance with the Australian standard or the code, they can be held account up to 10 years. So 10 year is the cutoff. It used to be infinity plus 7, which meant you had an infinite amount of time to find the defect, and then you had 7 years to act on it. But that got taken out about 10 or more years ago to make it a standard 10 years across the board. Wow. So I get approached by people to do pre-purchase inspections. So a pre-purchase inspection would involve, there's obviously an Australian standard for pre-purchase inspections. I see you had that up there. But a pre-purchase inspection is a visual inspection only. It's not an invasive inspection. It's purely visual. So you need to ensure that your inspector is suitably qualified, has enough experience to be able to identify all the problem areas. Things like when I do a pre-purchase inspection, the first thing I always roll up early. I want to be there half an hour before I'm due to get there so I can just take in the surroundings, and I want to look at how the land around the house lies. Is the water shedding away from the house? Is the water shedding going under the house? Are the gutters in a good state of repair, etc.? And I'll have a look at the roof, and then when the if the house is vacant and I can get access to the roof, I'll just do a quick look on the roof, just a very quick, either from the ladder or from the roof, and it depends whether you enter the roof or not, because it's really contentious. Because if there's broken tiles up there and you've photographed broken tiles, well, some people would think you did it, so I usually take video of me going up there as proof. And then during the inspection, when I meet the clients, the first thing I do, and everyone will do it differently, but my system is the first thing I like to do is I like to go work around the place clockwise, and I open every window, all the curtains in every room, leave all the doors open. I just have a quick scan in there to see is there anything obvious. And then I make sure I enter all the wet areas, the bathrooms. I turn every tap on and leave them on. Flush all the toilets, leave them, just keep walking around the house, opening all the bedroom doors, all the windows, the whole lot. Then I eventually get to the kitchen, turn the kitchen sink on, and let the water run. And I'll talk to the client for 5 or so minutes and let the water run. And then I will go outside and start my inspection outside. So I'm looking for things like under the floor, if it's on stumps and barriers, is there enough subfloor ventilation? Have they covered the weep holes? Have they breached the damp course? All these sort of things. So there's a humongous list of things that you look for, and you've got to do it quickly because you've got to be efficient. And being skilled, if you've got the skills, they're really obvious. They jump out at you. And the common things I see that people breach the damp course is inadequate subfloor ventilation. People have put garden beds right up against the brickwork or right up against the subfloor, limiting the subfloor ventilation, and then creates access for termites and other wood-bearing creatures or vermin to enter. And then once I've done that, I jump on the roof and I look at the roof. I'm looking for flashings. I'm looking for gutters. Box gutters are horrific. Box gutters, I don't know who thinks that box gutters are a good idea, but they are horrific.
Agree 100%. I see so many problems in multi-story apartment construction where the box gutters are impacting on multiple stories. Really, due to inadequate ability to get rid of rainwater.
And see, here lies the problem, because people often ask me, why does it get so wrong? But I get plans sent to me by architects, to quote a job and whatnot, and I'll look at the roof plan and I'll ring the architect and say, mate, I can't build this for you because your roof doesn't comply with the Australian standard AS3500. And they said, what do you mean? We always build them like that. I said, well, there's a code. It tells you how a box gutter needs to work, the size of it, its flow rate, its depth, its fall, how the sumps work, how the rain heads work. And often at the top, they get it wrong. So what happens is your ordinary builder might think, I've got a set of plans from a reputable architect, a well-known architect, an award-winning architect, who knows? And he'll get this plan and the architect's drawn that and he'll think, it obviously complies because it's been drawn by this architect. And building surveyors aren't necessarily all over it either, and they should be.
Yes.
They really should be. They're not, that I found. And so the builder goes about building this thing, and the plumber who signs off on the compliance because he's done the works,
yes,
he gets to the site and he's kind of left with whatever's been framed out with him, whatever's been designed. Now, if the plumber knows better, and often they don't, but if he knows better, he's kind of in that situation with, what do I do? So he may try and make it work. And if you're worth your salt, you'll just say no, because if that thing fails and you get a building inspection done afterwards and you do a defects report, well, people will be coming for you because you signed off on compliance. And it just snowballs down and it gets ugly. But it's a top-down problem. And as a building industry, we need to educate from the top all the way down so that everyone understands. Because I've asked many plumbers if they're aware of these standards, and many of them aren't aware of them. They've been to plumbing, they did their apprenticeship 30 years ago or more. And, things change, and have they kept up with it? Yeah. So these sort of things are really problematic. I see so many failures all the time. If we have a major inundation, it's usually a box gutter.
Okay, all right. Look, I also see a lot of failures and problems in buildings, but oftentimes I've got good news for people, and I can, tell them that their property isn't mold contaminated or is not showing any evidence of this. Do you have some success stories, because look, it's not all doom and gloom in people's properties. There's some beautiful buildings out there. Do you have any, like, a success story of a building inspection that was helpful?
Look, I usually get called in when things have gone wrong.
Okay.
So I normally see the disasters. So from that inspection point of view, people call me when they're in trouble. So I don't really get to report anything nice or good.
Okay, but by giving people factually correct information, it allows them to make an informed decision and at least feel confident. So, I guess that's also relevant to point out that sometimes giving people bad news allows people to digest that information and then act on that. So, I guess, I certainly get quite some satisfaction finding out that people have either addressed their moisture intrusion or accumulation issues, and their health has gone back to a normal state, or it's the fear of the water damage or what it might cause to their impact on their family disappears once they have carried out some sort of restorative or remediation work, or actually dealt immediately with the building defects. So I think there is some positives out there.
I think also, empowering people, giving them the knowledge is helpful too. So when we find a defect, we'll always report on how is to be rectified. We have to point out what the defect is, why it's a defect under the building regulations, what part of the regulations is the defect, and then tell them how to go about rectifying it and making it compliant. And I find that a lot of people get a lot of solace out of knowing, because most people don't know any better, but when they find out and then they can see things being done properly and they get educated themselves, they really become empowered and start feeling good again.
I guess, how do you personally deal with the fact that often, because your home is the most important thing to many people, it's their primary asset.
Yeah, absolutely.
Often they have gotten conflicting advice from different people.
Yeah.
How do you sort of deal with the fact that they might have already contacted some trade qualified people on the telephone, and they're now using that language to then try to see whether their narrative in their head is you're going to agree with it to make them feel good about either not dealing with it or dealing with, I often, I had a church ring me yesterday to tell me that they have a serious, that they're on a floodplain, that that their church gets regularly wet underneath, that they've got a severe smell of mold, and that they've gotten a local person who has put into the local Progress Press type paper that they deal with mold, and they've been told that they should put some solar fans under the church, and that will deal with the mold problem and make it go away. They genuinely are hopeful that that's correct and rang me to say, will this work? And I haven't seen the church, so it might assist, but I don't think it's going to get rid of the fact that they know that water came into direct physical contact with the subfloor, and it now stinks.
Yeah.
How do you deal with this when people say, well, we've got these box gutters and we don't intend to change them?
Well, I always tell people, most of the people that I get that referred to me we have a common contact, and it might be an architect, it might be a lawyer, it might be a building surveyor or whatever. And I always tell people straight up, I'm unbiased, and although you're paying my bill, I represent your house. So the house will be there long after you're gone. Yeah. I represent the house. So I'm the person who's just going to tell it as it is. I have no interest in supporting a view of theirs if I can't support it. I will give totally unbiased, and I make that clear from the start. Because like I said, I've done the houses that were built in 1854.
Yep.
and that's far outlived any of us.
Of course.
So I'll always represent the house, and sometimes that rubs people up the wrong way, and sometimes people like your honesty and think. It gives them some confidence that you're going to do the right thing. And whenever you find something, you have to back it up with evidence. That's why defects reports, when we do a defects report, they can be really expensive because I have to gather all the evidence about what is going wrong, and then all the compliance levels that it didn't comply with, and all the standards. I have to compile all that together and put it in a report. And sometimes things aren't always easy to identify straight out. And some things are really complex. Some things are so simple that they're complex. We had one client who had a house in Kew, and she had water damage in a bedroom that abutted a bathroom. And in the bathroom, they had a vanity basin, a toilet, a shower, and a bath in that order down the wall. And partway along that wall, her daughter's room, the carpet had been starting to get some mould on it. Okay. And the skirting board started to have mould on it, and it was really evident. So, ordinarily you'd think, okay, there's a water leak in the bathroom. So, initially I started looking in the bathroom, and I looked at the bathroom, and it looked really good. It looked intact. There was no signs of moisture in there. There's no evidence of any water damage or anything. So then I put a thermal camera on the wall, on the bedroom, on the daughter's bedroom side on the wall. And what I found was the water leak started up at around about 850, 900 mil high and worked its way down.
Okay.
So what we worked out is they had an in-wall toilet system.
Yes.
That was sandwiched, obviously, it's in the wall. And when the daughter was in bed, she would lean on the plasterboard just enough to impact the back of the water system.
Oh, wow.
And because the water system level was at its fullest, it was right at the overflow, but the way I won't say the brand, but the way that water system was constructed, if you pressed on the seam, it let the water roll out. So every time she rolled over in bed and she pressed on the wall, the water came. Now that took me a couple of hours from start to finish to work out and to prove. But that was one thing that, it's not immediately obvious. Like if you don't do the right things, you could start looking in the wrong areas and find yourself, doing things you don't need to do.
Well, you see, this is what I like about your approach to buildings and building inspections, that it is attention to detail and making every effort to articulate things accurately and use the right, be guided by your common sense and intuition, but really look at the environment and see how the environment is going to talk to you.
Exactly.
That's really important because I certainly find this too with the mold inspection arena. Often insurers or remediators will say that the visual inspection is fine. Everything looks good. And in many cases, it does look good because they've done a builder's clean or even a detail clean. But if they haven't addressed the fundamental damage to set, oftentimes the, base plates of water damaged timbers, and they've now sanded them. And even if they've used mechanical sanding, the top sides of the timbers might look okay. But what about underneath?
That's right.
What about all these other issues? What about the carpet that might be, or tile work that might be abutting right up to that room? So I think you can't always be completely guided by a visual inspection. And this is, why I definitely wanted to bring you on today, because you do need a range of experts to comment on buildings, because they are amazingly beautiful. We love living in them, but they all have these unique issues that are impacted on by the inhabitants themselves as well. Now,
exactly.
Now, I've mentioned the fact that you started off as a carpenter and in cabinetry. Do you have any other specific interests in property?
Oh, look, I love buildings. I'm a building freak. I can walk around. I was in New York recently and boring my wife to death because I was stopping her at every building, looking at all the details. I just love that. Yeah, I just love the way it's my life. It's everything that I do, and I love the way things go together. And I love the way how, I think of a building as a whole system. You've got to think about everything. Everything interrelates with everything, and everything's connected. Yeah. And I love to see the way that things were done in the past. And my experience in major renovations of old period style homes has given me that. And I really love to see how they're doing things in Europe. In Canada, in America, how they're a little bit more advanced than us with their air tightness and air quality controls
and administration as well, for sure.
Yeah, so I'm really big on trying to educate my clients particularly on the benefits of a good built environment with healthy indoor air quality.
Yeah, good. Well, that makes perfect sense to me. I've just got a couple of final questions for you, which what's your view on sick building syndrome? Because it's a bit of a catch-all term. And now more recently, it's CIRS, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or those buildings that could very well have lots of evidence for creating adverse indoor air quality, but certainly these are becoming terms used and applied to residential and commercial buildings. What do you sort of see? Do you get a lot of that?
I do, and it's really hard because the sick building syndrome, it doesn't affect everyone the same because we're all uniquely different. So and these people who suffer these illnesses, whatever they might be, and they range, there's a huge range of things from respiratory to onwards, and even mental health. A lot of these things you can't physically see. So the general public can think it's all a bit of a furphy, but because you can't see it. But it's real. It's real to the people that suffer from it. And I'm grateful that we can measure so that we can at least give people some solace to know that their indoor air quality is okay or it's not okay. Because for some people, they don't understand why they're sick. They don't know why that they've moved into this new apartment or house or whatever 12 months ago, and they suddenly develop this, these breathing difficulties or rashes or whatnot. And with technology now, we know much more, and we'll know more in the future, and we're getting better at diagnosing things. It's helping people to prove that they do have a problem, and most people don't realise that it's a real thing, indoor air quality. They don't understand their house as a system. I get people who say to me, Colin, I've got ducted heating, should I clean the ducts? And I say, well, yeah, you should clean the ducts like you vacuum the floor, or like you wipe the walls down or wipe the surfaces down, because try and educate them how, everything is a filter.
Exactly.
Everything, every surface, we're filters, like things stick to us. So I think it's very difficult for the people who really suffer, because the people who suffer bad. They're really sick people, and it's hard for them to find help out there, and it's hard for them to get people to remediate properly. And it's even hard for them and their spouses. It's terrible for their spouses and their family.
It's the sort of gradient of how it affects one person, but it's the other occupants in the house as well. And there's often so much anger associated with this. There's blame being apportioned to usually someone who you feel initiated the problem. And then it's these long delays that occur until something happens. Certainly with insurable events, often there's a lot of different stakeholders involved, and it just takes time. And so certainly when we become involved in these sorts of disputes, often we can hand over our findings. You or a building expert can hand over their findings, but it could take then months to resolve the issues. And the occupants either have the option of either dealing with this themselves and solving it, or waiting. And I often see people waiting for months to years when there's something that is quite straightforward to deal with, which could give them some intervention now.
And that's important like you said, that can be straightforward, but you have to follow the process. You have to do it 100%. You can't say, oh, that little bit's too hard, I'm not going to do that, or ignore that. That's the little bit that's going to let you down. That's the little bit that's going to continue to make you sick. So you need to do it wholeheartedly, 100%. And yeah, some things is kind of, like you throw a lot of money at it. You do throw a lot of money in it. But if it's the difference of being able to breathe and have a healthy built environment, then you either do that or move. And some people are so sick they can't move. They go somewhere else and the quality's worse.
All right, now I want to wrap this up, but I want to ask you one final question, and this impacts on, we've been hearing a lot about the cladding issues in Australia, which really opens up Pandora's box about whether or not there needs to be a tightening of legislation really for use and abuse of building materials, and also this whole issue of ventilation, condensation, and moisture accumulation, which is connected with the cladding issue as well. And so if that's been the sort of tipping point in Australia, where do you sort of see changes to regulations and rules and guidelines occurring, and how do you see that maybe changing?
Again, I think it's about, it's obviously top down, and it's about people's perception. Because when we first started bringing in 5-star energy rating, 6-star energy rating, you know, our bodies, our trade bodies, how can I say this without saying who they are, but they were very negative about implementing 5-star because they were saying, oh, it's the cost of this and it's the cost of that. And really the cost was very little. And now we're at 6-star, and on the terms of your average build, very little cost, maybe a couple of $1,000s to make sure that you hit those energy ratings. And now that the NCC's trying to tighten up air tightness, which is fantastic because we really need to tighten it up, but tightening up our air tightness in our home, we need to make sure we have a good home ventilation system. Because the tighter our houses are, we're going to have other problems. Our houses at the moment that we build are so leaky that we get away with a lot of things. A lot of problems go unnoticed because the house is leaking so much to get dried and ventilated. As we make these things tighter, the mold problems are going to get worse. And we need to educate everyone about the process, about ventilation, about how materials let vapor through and how they transfer between the walls, because we want to obviously avoid the condensation. We don't want condensating surfaces that the moisture is going to drop on because we're going to start mold. So we have to educate everybody. It's a whole industry have to be educated, and it's not that hard if we all get on board.
Yep.
And we need to get on board. There's many reasons. It's cheaper to live. Energy bills will come down. Our indoor air environment will be much better. I mean, that's how the whole, the sick building syndrome came around in the 70s when the oil crisis was on, and the price of oil went up. So architects, builders, and everyone sort of thought, oh, how are we going to save on this? So they started reclaiming the air without filtering it and running it back through the air conditioner or through the heating system, and that was kind of the rise of the sick building syndrome. So we can learn from the past, and certainly we are way behind the rest of the world. It's only in more recent years that our windows have been reasonably constructed from a thermal point of view more recently.
Very, very interesting. Now, Colin, I've put some links to you in the show notes. They're going to be at the bottom of this video. But
Yep.
Do you have any sort of final words on how do people find you?
Well, look, obviously I'm easy to find. You can find me on, obviously on the links here. Look me up on Instagram and Facebook, etc. My website. But more importantly, I would say to people that if you're going to buy a home, definitely get a pre-purchase inspection. So that there are always going to be defects. I always find a defect, right? But there's always, every house, you're buying something that's already done. But at least you know what you got, and you know what you're getting yourself into, and you'll know how to remediate or fix or attend to those things. And some of the things that we find are just maintenance items. So we just give people a list of things that are maintenance. Some we find are safety, some we find total defects where there's structural elements. But definitely get a home inspection before you buy. Be educated in that sense. And if the house, I hear people say to me, oh, Colin, the house is only 3 years old. That's why I didn't get a house report. And then I go back there 4 months later because they've had a major roof leak through 3 stories. Could have been avoided if they had a house inspection. So don't be that guy.
Collect your information. It's really exactly as the scientific approach. Do your due diligence in a sense. Collect quality information, make an informed decision, analyze that information, and then move on from there. Anyway, listen, Colin, thank you very much. This has been really informative and highly educational to myself as well. And I hope to all the viewers and listeners out there. In any case, I'm going to disconnect from Colin now, and I'll see you again. Anyway, thanks for now. Bye now. Bye. Okay. I hope that you found that informative and educational. I work with a lot of building inspectors and building experts. It is absolutely fundamental that you do get expert advice and opinion, especially if you're in dispute. As I said at the beginning of this, start with the building defects, then move on to the water damage and mold and your health symptoms. If you start with the mold and health symptoms, whilst they are emotionally important and physiologically important, if your claim is that it's the building that's doing it to you, you need to prove that, and you will need to get expert opinion. So don't avoid that, because it's fundamental. In any case, I've enjoyed talking to Colin. All the links to his websites are, as I stated below. I've got them up on screen now, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.